I was asking about the misconceptions that people might have, and you had brought up the.
To answer some of those misconceptions, our tribe, uh, they think that we get a lot of casino money, and it doesn't. I think it equates to a couple $100 a year for me because I'm not in any elder program or anything like that where they take care. The tribe takes care of you. Uh, I get that money from the economic developments that the tribe has, basically. And if they have extra, they give it out to all the tribal members each year, usually before Christmas. So that misconception that you have, casino money, it's it's not that much, I would say, for some people. It's really not significant. Um, my mom gets a little more because the tribe owns land, and then as an elder, it's a matriarchal society, so she owns the land, and currently they're using that for gem and mineral rights, and oil rights right now. And so that company who's renting that land pays the tribe, and then that goes into a fund and goes towards populations of the tribe who are more vulnerable than myself. I'm working, and in that context, the tribe would not have a lot of money going towards me, and that makes sense.
Does being part of that program in which you get paid some amount from like casino money and such, does that make anybody from the tribe maybe exempt from like traditional U.S. programs like Social Security or Medicare, things like that?
Not that I know of. There is a separate form on the taxes that you fill out, and it's like, I think it's literally called, um, I think it's a 1099 special. I think it's what it's called on the taxes. And you report this money each year for your taxes. It doesn't affect other social programs because, again, sometimes the amount is significant for the elders of the tribe, but um, not for others. But it shouldn't affect your social security or anything like that.
Okay. All right. So I know you mentioned that poverty is still like an issue within the tribes, even though like there's this idea that everyone owns casinos and everyone's like thriving and bustling. Um, Along those lines, we've seen how people in the lower economic rung have been affected by COVID-19 this year. Um, are how has COVID-19 affected the tribal populations that you are aware of? I don't expect you to be a spokesman for all Native Americans and all that stuff, but just from what you know, what has the effect been?
It's been pretty bad, just like maybe some areas of the world with not the resources of modernized countries might experience similar. I think that the Navajo Nation reported yesterday that it was the first day without a positive COVID test, and they had been preparing long before anyone else in the U.S. Um, for this, and you see that too in places like my wife's country in El Salvador, just because you just might not have the resources to deal with a number of population getting sick from COVID. Um, in that sense, it's a privilege for certain countries to be able to enact policies like herd immunity in Sweden because they have the resources to deal with if the populations get sick. In that context, you can maybe even use COVID as a framework for maybe oppression in societies, because if you look at it, potentially the populations who don't have great access to healthcare are getting hit harder. And in that context, you can look at it as, why is that happening?
You said the Navajo Nation had been preparing like long before other, I guess, pockets of American society. What were they doing in order to prepped?
They were completely getting ready to shut everyone in and out, like complete quarantine, no roadblocks, everything like that. And this was way before the U.S. government acted. Um, there was there was a couple of more tribes too, in I believe Alaska and other places that were just preparing for it a lot more than the U.S. government. And even then, they've been hit pretty hard, actually, compared to other populations. We're still, of course, looking at all the data of COVID, and we don't know, what if there's a genetic marker or something. That's a reason too. But sorry, I guess what was the question again? I was going off on COVID, and I know that.
No, no, no. That was essentially the question. Like, I was asking what they had done to prep, because you had mentioned that they were prepping ahead of time, um, but compared to the rest of the U.S. So, yeah, you hit on what they had done. Clamping down people. With the um, basically the self quarantine thing that we started doing in March, where it's like 14 days to slow the spread, and everyone started going out after 7 days. So that's interesting. Uh, I was thinking about the 7 days thingy, where we just decided that, you know what, we're done quarantining. We're gonna go outside. Um, all right. So I guess I want to sort of, you know, tie this up in a bow, um, by asking. So you said over the last couple of months you've been learning a lot more about, not just Native American issues, but issues, regarding marginalized groups and all that stuff. Based off of all the learning and research that you've been doing over the past couple of months, um, do you see, a roadmap for, a positive outcome in, whether it's better policies being enacted to sort of right the wrongs of our past when it comes to these different marginalized groups, and definitely including Native Americans. So do you see a roadmap for positive outcome? Why or why not? And floor is yours.
Yeah, I think that I think that laws reflect what we believe as a society because it's just written down, it's concrete, and they're built to protect or not protect certain aspects or populations of societies. You have to look at the 1960s and what the Civil Rights Bill meant to so many people. It was a solid piece of legislation that moved us forward. We hope because I guess in the context of why I am researching all the marginalized populations is to educate myself to help them because I guess you could call it a uh, I don't know, a conscious shift, I guess, because when I saw what was happening on the news recently, it just reminded me of the textbooks of the 1960s and the pictures in black and white. And as a part-time historian, or I claim to be anyway, um, eh, you're always asking yourself, can we learn from the past? And it just didn't look like that to me. And so I decided to try to do whatever I could to help people who were asking for help. And through that, meeting people who said, you should look at this group too. They're marginalized. And that's what the Monroe group has been all about, is just meeting different people who have different causes and just listening and educating myself through that. And so policy change would be a big start. If you change laws to punish people for certain things more than other things, or to give a leg up to certain populations, just calling that what it is, you do change, you do manifest destiny in that sense of big populations. That would be at minimum the way forward. At maximum, you should just increase the education of getting to know someone. Again, I talked about this in a somewhere else, but the local the local director of the Rotary Club said he just wants to bring in someone of a different ethnicity like you have today. and just to meet them and ask them a bit about their culture and everything like that, just in an effort to understand where they're coming from. I think that's the most powerful roadmap forward if we're willing to be able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, even if, because you do not have to condone or fully agree with someone um, to understand them. You can just understand them, and that, again, that is not completely agreeing with what they're presenting, but just by understanding, that's how you break down everything that's happening. It's it's through not being able to have an honest conversation now with certain groups of populations in this country that we've gotten so polarized that we just can't even discuss our differences. And so, well, of course, that situation is always going to erupt. I mean, and really the way forward we should be looking at is, well, I just referred to the book Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. And in the prologue, he says, every single great civilization throughout history, did they think they were going down? No, they didn't. And why is that? And he argues that it's internal conflict and not external conflict. It's usually not a great conquering force that kills the next dominant civilization at the time. Uh, if that happens, they weren't the dominant civilization at the time. And so it's always been internal class warfare that has brought down these great civilizations. It's the people on top and in charge not being able to understand or care enough about the people on bottom. So finally, the people on bottom revolted in different ways and eventually could lead to even civil war. And that weakened the empire as a whole just enough for another civilization or empire to take its stance. And, maybe my motivation too as an American is, this is the great experiment in the galaxy. So in order to keep it going, guys, we might want to talk about our differences and not have another civil war enabling Eastern civilization to overtake Western civilization, which is what is set up next. Regardless of history, it's going to happen, but we're certainly speeding it up by fighting each other. That's kind of the motivation, to help the marginalized so that they don't revolt and do a civil war and we have class warfare, because, I mean, that could be where it's headed, unfortunately, because you have a classism issue too, besides a racism issue in this country.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think it sort of shapes itself up to seem like a racism issue, because a lot of the people who fall along the if you want to call it lower class, upper class spectrum, or along the less affluent spectrum, a lot of people who fall there are from minority groups, right? And because of that, it seems like, well, it's a white versus everyone else situation, but really it's the haves versus the have-nots situations. And for a long time, we haven't done enough to address the have-nots. And like you said, in what seemed like a very grim prediction, but also not a very far off prediction, the way things are going, if that isn't addressed, it soon becomes like an internal conflict that leaves the door open for other forces to take over. But yeah. I actually did want to ask you something else before that wrap up question. So yes, so that wasn't the wrap up. I did have another question. You've mentioned a couple of policies that have been sort of targeted at whether it's erasing Native American identity or just not really been beneficial to Native American culture. And I imagine that all these policies span across both Democratic and Republican administrations. Um, do you feel like there is a political party right now that does take Native American issues to heart and like actually works on them? And if not, do you feel like the only way to get that across is to have Native American representation at those highest levels?
No and yes.
No, and yes. Okay. No, no,
They
neither party does anything for Native Americans. And
they
yes,
do, they do,
okay.
but you could you wonder about sincerity of why they're doing it and motivations why they might be doing it. For of course they need votes. Let's be honest, that's what it is in this country. Um, um, no, and sometimes in each presidencies, Democratic, Republican, some awful things have happened to local tribes. You know, you can just look at the Dakota pipeline. You know, recently that was atrocious because they were bulldozing our graveyards. Their graveyards, excuse me. I mean, that is just sacred territory, and the U.S. government is just saying, nope, don't care. You know, so this is an issue over and over today, um, too. Yes, we need representation at the highest level. Actually, okay, this is an aside, but my mom was adopted, and the family she was adopted into, one of the white members married the future chief of the Cherokee tribe, Bill John Baker. And so he is my uncle, but through adoption. And the Cherokee tribe in Oklahoma is actually quite powerful politically, and they exercised their treaty rights, I believe, in 2014, 2016, to actually have a representative in the House. The US government didn't honor that precisely, which is pretty common for them, not honoring treaties with indigenous people of this country, which is a lot of what Native rights is about, obviously. Um, but they did allow a representative from that tribe to sit on certain panels for the House and actually have a say in environmental policy. And I believe she's in women's rights also. And that might be having an impact because we see that certain federal officers are being placed in certain areas to for environmental issues with tribes, and with federal officers being placed to hopefully solve more of the cases of the murdered indigenous women in this country as well. Michigan finally got its first federal officer for that post recently. So, but do I think that Trump is completely for natives because he did that recently? No, I think he wants our votes, but I think that's what both sides are doing. And so I'm not here to say that historically Democrats and Republicans have been just fantastic to us. And yes, more representation because some tribes are actually quite powerful because just different ethoses that they've had. That particular tribe really enacted education, valued education through that. And when when my dad first was growing up in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the white high school was the high school of choice, and now everyone is clamoring to get into the charter native school because of the level of education there is stellar, actually. And so you have different ways of influencing and keeping your culture. You know, and each tribe, like I said, is multifaceted and different to that approach and what they do.
So that high school that you said that people are clamoring to get into, is it both Native people and white people trying to get into that high school?
Yes,
Oh,
but very much it was created for the Cherokee tribe.
yeah,
And so that's, and that's affiliated with the powwow that they have there and everything that they do there. That the Cherokees basically are Tahlequah, if
yeah.
you will.
But that's interesting that it's a diverse population that are clamoring to get into that school, even though it was, you know, originally intended as a Cherokee school. I think that's a good thing. That shows progression over there, I suppose. Small
I
wins, I
think
suppose.
I believe Princeton recently had its first valedictorian ever that was black. So as you said, that would be my ethos for forwardness is just education on all levels because I don't want to completely label and subject people into groups and boxes, but if you're just more educated on the matters, you tend to have less confusion over the issues, which is at a minimum the least amount of our worries, but it's leading to a lot of trouble here. I'm finding that when I sit down and talk to people on the other side, most of them, for the most part, are willing to have a conversation, especially with, with again, movements that I've been a part of recently, like Black Lives Matter and Native rights issues movements. They, they hear me out, and if they do hear me out, they usually agree and maybe want the same things, and you find that they're confused a lot of the time. And I'm not saying that I know everything, because I'm confused about what their motivations are a lot of the time. And so again, we talked about that polarity. It is hard sometimes, but I just stomach what I have to say and listen, because again, who am I expecting to help if I can't listen to someone, Am I expecting them to listen to me? I don't think so. And so it's but as far as representation and power moves, if this type of government continues, in that you're going for votes and things like that, yes, you would want as many representatives in the House and Senate as possible.
Okay. Who would determine, I guess, who would have the power to either abide by or not abide by the treaty? I think treaty rights is what you said, that the Cherokee tribe tried to.
Oh, yes.
In 2014, right? So would it be the president?
Congress.
Oh, it would be
Most
Congress?
of the time, Congress.
Okay.
It's usually a lot of the treaties, because and recently, Gorsh, a U.S. Supreme Court justice, said, treaties used to be the bedrock of U.S. law, and so we're going to honor this. And in this particular treaty, it said all of these stipulations to be determined by Congress, and Congress just wouldn't budge on the situation. So of course it went to the court after that, who decided for them in this case, and they this again is just for individual rights in the area. It's not to increase tribal sovereignty, but they voted, in, I guess, if you will, in favor of this particular native in that case. But yeah, I guess that it's mostly Congress, because it's written into these treaties. But again, a lot of these treaties just weren't quite honored. My tribe including, I mean, when the chief was Black Kettle in 1864, we had a treaty with the U.S. government. I'm sorry if I can't remember the name of it, but through that treaty, it just wasn't honored, and General Shivington of the U.S. Armed Forces slaughtered our tribe, and the the site of that is in Colorado, actually, at the time, and it's the only national monument in the U.S. that has the word massacre in it, because it was. And so you see historically and recently that the U.S. government not honoring these treaties can have a great impact on society as a whole, And so we'll see what happens with that, because you can't honor all of these treaties. I mean, they'd have to give Manhattan over to this small tribe.
That's not gonna happen.
Exactly. The perversion and just deceitfulness of the U.S. government at the time was just shameful, because, in my opinion, again, as a citizen of Monroe County and maybe not a native, how could a modern society at the time break contracts and treaties with, say, sovereign nations and other countries? That's just not how a modern country, that's just not how they act. But that was right after the Civil War too, so we were kind of reading from that.
All right, Graham, thank you for taking the time. I learned a lot, and we're probably going to talk more, outside of this interview, just because I know I'm going to have more questions. How can people follow you, whether it's social media or whether it's any of the activism stuff you're doing, or anything you want people to know about? The floor is yours. 2 minutes, a minute, take as long as you want.
Okay, so I guess how this all came about was, again, conscious shift, saw people in the streets. And one of the first people to contact me was someone who I went to high school with and graduated with, named Katie Beth Davis. And she's highly involved in Black Lives Matter, but also identifies indigenously. And she was made fun of while protesting Black Lives Matter at a current statue we have of General George Armstrong. In context to what I'm talking about, that's the same tribe, Black Kettle, who made peace with the US government. 4 years later, he was massacred by this person, Custer. And he's up in our town because he's a Civil War hero. But to my tribe, he's not. And so I was surprised when someone called me and said that they wanted to relocate the statue. That's pretty common now. And so that's basically how I got involved in everything, was starting to protest the statue because, well, you can argue, we can get into a whole nother thing about the history and textbooks being whitewashed in this country. And that's why people cannot identify with Black culture, because the history has been erased to some extent, and Native culture because the history has been erased. Again, I talk about maybe people not being able to identify because if they're not taught it in the textbooks, and again, well, why would you want to remind yourself that your ancestors did terrible things to two groups of people in order to form a country? It's hard sometimes. And so to follow me, Graham Edward Denton on Facebook, and I usually post about many different things. Currently involved with it was the relocation of the statue, but City Hall actually listened to us, and they are actually installing another piece of George Custer history that talks about his role in the American Indian War, where I just spoke with my tribal officials, and they said, without better context, we feel basically the way we feel about him is probably how Jewish people feel about Hitler, because it's a genocide. And so I'm fascinated to see that my local elected officials are going to install that part of history. That's probably one of the main things that I'm involved in right now. But of course, Black Lives Matter too, because I mean, if you look at the help that the Native community has received and the lack of persecution from the Black population towards Natives, it's significantly historically lower. And so I can see why, of course, and a minority connection of why those two populations are working together. And I'm just shocked that people were interested in what is important to me in my culture. And that's kind of what you see a little bit here, is a conscious shift as the whole country kind of comes into that play. Yeah, that's all I have.
All right. Graham, again, thank you. And yeah, guys, that is a wrap.